Good morning, everyone. So this morning, I'd like to share with you about governance or the good governance, particularly building an effective framework in good governance. So our objective this morning, at the end of this presentation, it is expected that you will be able to understand the concepts of governance as well as the good governance. What about this concept of governance? The effective citizen participation are indeed practices regarding good governance. In distinguishing between government activity and governance, we'll first state what governance comprises, the formal as well as the informal institutions that determine how power is exercised in society and how decisions are taken and how citizens have their say in the process of governing. Therefore, governance is not a sole concern of the government, but it is all those involved in public decision. That's according to the public administration, particularly the UN DESA. Okay? Everyone is involved, not only the government, but as well as the constituents, the people, the civil society. So what about this governance? It is an exercise of economic, political, and administrative authority to manage a country's affairs at all levels. It comprises the mechanisms, processes, and institutions through which citizens and groups articulate their interests, exercise their legal rights, meet their obligations, and mediate their differences. That's according to the study of UNDP 1997. So once again, an exercise of economic, political, as well as administrative authority. And I think now in the present situation, particularly in the present administration of Duterte administration, and we can say that this definition is of course applicable when we talk about economics, political, as well as the administrative authority. But remember on this, through which citizens and groups articulate their interests, exercise their legal rights, meet their obligations, and mediate their differences. Siguro there are lapses on this, okay, especially to the present administration when we talk about governance. An elusive concept in political science. It is because governance practices and administrative structures are geographically, historically, as well as culturally bound. Okay? Administrative structures, then geographically, historically, as well as culturally bound. That's why it is an elusive concept when you talk about the political science. Then government as well as governance have different meanings. Take note on this across the geographical space and time. Differences aside, certain elements of good governance common to all, and these are, so take note, the difference between the two. Ownership, empowerment of the citizen, then effectiveness in economic, social, and political spheres. So these are the two, okay, differences aside the certain elements of good governance, which is common, of course, to all of this, either the government as well as to governance. The quality and effectiveness of the governance enhance the state's capacity in the strategic areas that are vital in the process of development. The just exercise and authority is one. A capacity for problem solving and the conflict resolution is also one. and the performance of its functions based on the involvement of a societal coalition is another. So that's the two different things. The authority is one, problem solving is one, conflict resolution is one, while the other is the involvement of the societal coalition. So another concept of governments of the different institution, according to the World Bank in 1992, governance is a method through which power is exercised in the management of the country's political, economic, social resources for the development. That's according to World Bank. Then according to the ASEAN Development Bank, governance is a manner in which power is exercised in the management of the country's social and economic resources for development. Then for the Canada Institute of Governance, governance is the process whereby the societies or organizations make important decisions, determine whom they involve, and how they render account. Then if you notice the three definitions coming from the three different institutions, they are more or less interrelated depending on the terms used. But what is common there is the exercise of power. In the other side, according to the Canada Institute, make important decisions. Okay, that's also an exercise of power. So look at the similarity of the different concepts of governance in terms of the three different institutions. Then, governance is the exercise of economic, political, administrative authority to manage a country's affair at all levels. At all levels. It comprises the mechanisms, processes, and institutions through which citizens and groups articulate their interests, exercise their legal rights, meet their obligations, and mediate their differences. So, we had already mentioned that to the previous slide according to the UNDP 1997. Kaya nga it's really not easy when you talk about governance. Okay? There are three key actors. You look at these three key actors when you talk about governance. What are these three key actors? You look at that Venn diagram. The state, the civil society, as well as the market. Those are the three actors when you talk about governance. Creating a favorable political, legal, and economic environment that's more on the state. While on the market, creating opportunities for people para sila mabuhay. While the civil society mobilizing people's participation. Then if you notice the three diagram, the three actors, they are interrelated. They are interconnected. Take note as interconnected, which means the three should go hand in hand. And if you separate one, may missing na isa. That's why with these three actors, they hold hands together when you talk about this governance. Okay? What about the stakeholders in governance? You look at this one. The stakeholders are the legislative, that includes like the House of Congress as well as the senators. They are the legislating body who make the law. Then the executive, of course, that's in the office of the president. Then the judiciary, the implementing agency of the law made by the legislative as well as signed by the executive. If you notice the three, these are the three branches of the government: the executive, legislative, and the judiciary. But they are stakeholders in governance. And of course, the other one is media. Why media? I think we know very well. They are stakeholders in which all the informations. Kaya pinapalabas nila, walang itinatago. The private sectors, of course, that's one because it helps a lot to governance. Then sa social organization, that's also another. Of course, the people, the civil society. Then another thing is the political parties. In the Philippines, we have a lot of political parties because we are multi-political tayo. Unlike in the other states, in the United States, there are only two political party na maglalaban. Pero sa atin, that's why we cannot blame those politicians. Majority of them are balingbing. You know the term balingbing. Kung sino yung marami, lipat agad because of these multi-political parties in our country. But remember, they are the stakeholders of governance. When we talk about governance, there are 8 stakeholders, so take note on that. What about the definitions of the good governance? And what's the difference between good governance and moral governance? I was invited in the BARM when we had our panel discussion about moral governance. Then they differentiate the two, the good as well as moral governance. And for them, that moral governance, parang it's like an umbrella of the good governance because moral governance is coming from the above, the supreme. So may parang divine touch, while good governance is merely more on human. But literally, they are first cousin. But here, when I talk about good governance, entails the sound public sector management. Take note of sound public sector management. Its efficiency, effectiveness, as well as the economy. And it talks also about accountability. Then exchange and free flow of information, that's transparency. And the legal framework for development, that's justice, respect for human rights and liberties. That's according to the United Nations Public Administration. So once again, the good governance entails sound public sector management, its efficiency, effectiveness, and economy, the accountability, exchange of free flow of information, which is transparency, then a legal framework for development, justice, respect for human rights, and liberty. So that's a good governance. There are 4 components when we talk about good governance. First is legitimacy. Government should have a consent of the governed to be legitimate. That's why in our plebiscite, hindi yan basta-basta. In our election, hindi basta-basta. Para maging legitimate sila, dapat all of us, the constituent, the governed, should be included na walang ma-left out. Okay? Kaya nga, government should have the consent of the governed. Kung sino yung nasa mga officials natin, dapat alam yan ng mga tao din. Kaya nga, we are in a democratic country. Our style of the government is democratic country. Remember, what is democracy? It is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people to be legitimate. That's according to Abraham Lincoln. Diba, remember the president, a former president of the United States, when they talk about democracy, which is related to this. Government should have a consent of the governed. Because, once again, we are in a democratic country, and democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Okay? Second components of good governance is accountability. Ensuring transparency, being answerable for the actions, and media freedom. Now, the question on yung Philippine Sea natin, who is accountable? The previous president, si Aquino, or the present administration, si idol ninyo, si Duterte. Pag si Duterte ang tatanungin, hugas kamay siya. I am not accountable. It is the previous president na ibinigay yung China. Kaya nga ngayon, nabayot siya sa China. Kasi sabi daw. But remember, in fairness naman, in the previous administration, we won the battle in the International Tribunal na yung karagatan na atin yon. Pero ngayon, parang whether we like it or not, ibinibigay. But remember, during the campaign, sabi niya, I will go there together with Navy ship. Then I'll bring the flag, our flag, the Philippine flag. Then, ilalagay, tatayo ko yan doon. Kung ano mang mangyari sa akin, kayo nang bahala. Ngayon, anong ginawa? Ayaw niyang aminin. Isisi pa rin niya. But whether we like it or not, because of the good governance, one of the component, he is accountable. Then, hinamon niya ngayon si Carpio, pero nabayot din. Umatras. Ang ipalaban niya, ang kanyang sekretary, nabayot din. So, atat na atat tong sekretary niya. So, what happened? Hugas kamay. Kay hugas kamay, isisi sa previous administration. And it should not be like that when we talk about good governance. Because this is one of the component. So, remember. Third is competence. Effective policy making, implementation, and service delivery. Now, with the pandemic, effective policy making, maraming ang ayaw na ni Doke. Pero paugat pa rin si Doke. I don't know kung anong karisma niya na nagustuhan. Is he competent with this effective in policy making, especially to the Department of itong DOH? Sino ngayon ang mga leader ng mga namumuno sa DOH? Puro sundalo. Kaya naman siguro, pero iba tala pag doktor ilagay doon. Competent kaya yung mga taong yon? Then when we talk about implementation, ang ayuda, the delivery of services, what happened to ayuda? Pili-pili lang, yung iba hindi pa rin nakakain. Okay, dapat competence, one of the component, good governance. I'm not saying na wala silang nagawa, meron man ding kagandahan. Pero pag may tutulong, like this community pantry now, kasi nakita ng mga tao na may problema ang ating pamahalaan. Hindi mabigyan lahat. Ano namang ginawa ng ating pamahalaan? Parang insecure. Mga NPA yan, narigtag agad. NPA yan, gawa yung NPA. Na halos lahat ngayon, buong bayan, sinakyan na naman din nila. Kita mo yon? Are they competent the way they govern? And that's the question. Bakit, sabi ko nga, bakit mga insecure itong mga taong ito? Pag may magsalita against, personal agad. Feeling bright. Is that competency? So that's the point there. But remember, this is one component of the good governance. Then of course, the number 4, respect for law and protection of human rights. Ito ngayon, this is a big issue now. Respect for law and protection of human rights. Bakit issue yan? Because of this extrajudicial killing. And our government, they will not accept. Okay? Hugas kamay, not accountable. Hindi daw sila accountable, nagpapatayan lang daw. Nung krinitik ng Vice President, ginawang drug czar si Robredo. Ang ginawa, mag-aksyon na sana, pero doon siya sa middle, mga big time, nakaangkla, para makuha na yung big time na mga drug lord. Then what happened? Tinanggal kasi wala daw protocol. Insecure? And I don't know. Remember what happened sa mga pinapatay in this tukhang drug on war? Mga pobre, walang kalaban-laban. May mga middle class ba? Yes, meron mang namamatay, nahuhuli, ilan lang pinatay. Mga mayor sa Leyte, mayor natin dito. Okay? Pinatay. Pero ilan lang na nasa medyo mataas-taas. But the majority, thousands of people died of this tukhang and no one is accountable. Hugas kamay lahat. Pero malinaw naman, there are a lot already. Parang pattern ba? Patayin kita, lagyan kita ng baril na 38, tapos ipalabas, nagpapatayan yan sila. But remember, that's not good governance. Kaya nga, one of the component of this good governance is respect for law and protection of the human rights. Protection of the human rights. Kaya nga, malaking usapin ito. Tapos, pag may mangyari, hamunin agad yung Human Rights Commission. O, saan na kayo? Magsalita kayo. Ito yung biktima ng mga addict. So, take note on that. Sabi nga sa campaign, I hate drugs. There is so much problem in this country because now he is also the problem. Okay? Bakit? Yes, may nagawa naman na kabutihan, pero ang problema hindi magpasabi ba? Puro personalan. And according to his secretary, he is the only person who is authorized na pwedeng magbuyayaw, pwedeng magmalika sa Cebuano, pwede siyang magbinastos. So tama ba yun? That's the point there. So, is that good governance? So, tayo na ang magdesisyon. So, there are elements of this good governance. So, take note the elements of good governance. Effective and efficient delivery of public services. Inaasahan sana yon. Pero sabi nga, ang ayuda, epektibo kaya, efficient kaya, or pinipili lang. Itong 4Ps, alam nyo, pili-pili lang din yan. Okay? Politika. The decent standard of living for all. Decent standard kaya, kadami-daming pobre. Okay? Pinapatalsik, mga squatters. So may problema. If this is one of the elements go to, dapat decent standard of living for all. Dapat. Then, constitutionalism. What about this? That everything should be, we act everything in accordance to that basic law of the land, which is our constitution. Then we have the rule of law. Okay? Pero here in the Philippines, we have a lot of law. Thousands na ang ating law. But the implementation is a problem. That's really the big problem. Justice. That's another element. But there are still a lot of injustices. Security of persons and property. Once again, security of persons and property. Here in our land, especially in South UP, secure kaya ang mga tao doon with their property? Di ba inagaw? Daming evacuees? Hanggang hindi pa nakabalik. Anong ginawa sa government? That's the point. Electoral and participation, participatory democracy. Yes, we have the rights of suffrage. That's why all of us should elect our leader na talagang qualified, hindi yung sikat lang, ato ni. Okay? Then, mag-die hard ka na. Kahit na mali, okay lang sa'yo. Sabi ko, ato man. Atin. Ang ating president, we are happy for that. And I salute the good things na ginawa niya. But I will not salute sa mga bad things na ginawa niya. Marami din. Okay, marami din. Tandaan niyo yan. Kaya nga, buksan ang isipan natin. And we are all educators. Tingnan ninyo yan. Okay? Huwag lang magbulag-bulagan, magbingi-bingian. But that's related to electoral and participatory democracy kasi pinili man natin. So we have to take the consequence. The respect of human rights and basic freedoms, nabanggit na natin yan, na may problema din dyan when we talk about that element. Transparency, accountability, ethics, and integrity. Ayon. Transparency, accountability, ethics, integrity. Sabi, kunin ko lahat mga general kasi may integridad yun sila, hindi yan sila corrupt. But remember what happened to our PhilHealth. Saan na si General? Nawala. That's billion of money nawala. Pero anong nangyari ngayon? Integrity. Sabi nga, in your dreams. Equity. What about equity? What's the difference between equity and equality? Pariente? Interrelated? Equity, that's, of course, pariente sa equality. Pero itong dapat, yung pantay-pantay. Mahirap man, pobre man, may pera ka man, wala ka mang pera, dapat pantay yung pananaw sa iba't ibang constituents o sa lahat na bagay. Okay? In a good governance. Then, inform citizenry. I think inform naman tayo because of the social media. Pero kahit na ini-inform tayo, yung iba, tingnan nyo, inform na nga, pero siyempre, die hard man. Kahit na our God is a stupid God, pumalakpak pa. Anong klaseng Panginoon nyo? Your God is a stupid God. My God is different from your God. Okay? Then pag may magsalita na pare, obispo, tumahimik ka dyan. Kasi inform na nga, alam na alam natin kung anong nangyayari. Okay? Kasi inform tayo. Pero anong nangyayari? Pero yung iba, tameme, ayaw magsalita. Okay? That's the point there. Question, may good governance ba? So that's the point. Then, there are signs of poor governance. So the elements, may mga components now. Take note in the signs of poor governance. Failure to distinguish between public and private interests. Once again ha, ito yon, isa sa signs of poor failure to distinguish between public and the private interests. Sa pamunuan natin, ang daming mga vested interests which is more on private. I'll cite you a basic example on this. Remember Gina Lopez? Okay? During the appointment na sana, hindi siya natanggap bilang DNR secretary kasi gusto niya talagang mahal niya ang environment, may pagbabago. Okay? Bakit? Sino yung mga appointing authority? Congressman, senators, may-ari ng mga mining. So, they have a vested interest. They are private but may vested interest. So, ibig sabihin, that's a poor sign. Failure to distinguish between public as well as the private interests. I think si Duterte, may failure ba? Yes, of course, meron. Dami. Madami din. May pasado? Yes, marami ding pasado siya. Pero when I talk about the signs of poor governance, nandoon. Okay? Then, failure to establish the rule of law. Ako nang bahala ninyo mga pulis, mga sundalo. Kung may ano, akinin ko. Kaya nga, mga sundalo, pulis, patayin ka na lang. Makasalanan ka. So, failure to establish the rule of law. Then, they justify everything. Kasalanan yan. Then tayo, isip lang tayo, bakit nag-addict ka? Bakit pusher ka? Bakit ganito ka? So, therefore, sana patayin ka. So, wala ng pag-asang tao. So, failure to establish the rule of law. We have the law. Pero wala kang pera, pobre ka. That's the problem. Then, priorities inconsistent with development. What about now? What happened to the build program? Priorities, inconsistencies with development. And we have the pandemic. Ano yung sa Manila Bay? Sinira ang ano sa Cebu, ang kalikasan, nilagay doon yon. Billions of money pinag-usapan. Ngayon sa pandemic, walang pera. Kasi ito yung priority namin. Pero dapat, sabi na may nagsasabi, dapat wag muna, ihinto yan. I-convert yung money dito sa pandemic. Okay? Mayroon ding, sabi nga, priorities inconsistent with development. Kasi hindi pa nararapat ngayon. Okay? Because of the pandemic. Pwede naman yung i-declare, wag muna. Unahin natin to kasi ito yung pinaka-problema ngayon. So, once again, priorities inconsistent with the development. Development, human development sana para mapagaling, mawala itong pandemic. Pero nandoon, hindi nakita yung sitwasyon. Then, excessive regulations. So, mayroon din. Sobra-sobra. Okay, that's the point there. That's the sign of poor governance. There are other definitions of good governance. Governance hindi yan governance. Okay, mali lang yan. Other definitions, synonymous of participatory and democratic governance. Then, governance, also synonymous with the participatory governance. So yes, pare-pareho lang. Dito, participatory governance, ito naman, democratic, participatory, and democratic governance. Then, downward, good governance is as democracy plus. Then, the other side is good governance by the questions it tackles. So, that's other definition when we talk about good governance. What about this synonymous with participatory and democratic governance? Good governance as an expression of participatory and democratic governance. This concept of democratic and participatory governance is characterized by the following features according to the study of Khan in 2005. Number 1, full protection and promotion of civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights for all. Second, practice of democracy, respect for human rights, including minority rights, especially the minority rights. Okay? What about these minority rights? Who are the minorities here? And of course, the indigenous people. Human rights, including the minority rights. Okay? Then, inclusive political processes, allowing genuine participation by all citizens. Then, freedom of media to perform their essential role and the right of the public to access to information. I think we have a law here. Yung the law on yung the access of information, meron tayo dyan. What about this good governance as synonymous with participatory governance? The idea of participatory governance has gained enormous popularity in recent times, both in the academic discourse as well as the actual practice. The analysts have used theoretical constructs as a deliberative democracy and empowered participatory governance to scrutinize the scope and limitation of people's participation in the process of governance. The recent emphasis of good governance as the foundation of sustained and equitable development has generated widespread interest in the participation in the development circle, as effective participation by all stakeholders, especially at local level of government, has come to be viewed as necessary condition for promoting good governance. That's all about good governance as synonymous to participatory governance. Then what about this good governance by questions it tackles? Number 1, ito yung mga tanong. How best to build trust, participation, legitimacy, accountability, and efficacy in public governance? Second question, how to incorporate competing demands of various stakeholders, including the businesses and local communities, so that they complement one another. In short, how to balance relation with the governance processes. Third, how to introduce engagement practices in communities to achieve sustainable economic, social, cultural, and environmental development. And lastly, how to transform public administration from isolated techno-bureaucratic institution to a more engaging based institution, thereby it more transparency, effective, and perhaps above all, thus trusted. So that's under good governance by the questions it tackles. What about good governance as democracy plus? The concept of good governance incorporates the following: democratic governance for sustainable human development. Democratic governance means that, number 1, people's human rights and fundamental freedoms are respected, allowing them to live in dignity. Nangyayari kaya sa atin? Yes, nangyayari. Pero may problema dyan. Second, people have a say in decisions that affect their lives. Pinakinggan bang mga tao? To our leaders? Sana naman. People can hold decision makers accountable. Sabi nga ni Carpio, ang ginawa ni Duterte, pwede siyang ma-impeach. But the problem, paano siya ma-impeach? Kasi mga tauhan niya nasa Senado, nasa Kongreso, walang susuporta. Kasi totoo naman, kung mag-isip lang mga tao, especially mga politician, pwede siyang ma-impeach. Kasi the leaders, the congressman as well as the senators, they are our representative. They are our voice. Kaya nga, people can hold decision makers accountable. Fourth, social interactions are governed by inclusive and fair rules, institutions, and practices. Then, women are equal partners with men in both private and public spheres of life and decision making. May problema ba dito? I think there's a problem. How many are our legislators na mga kababaihan? Mabibilang mo lang sa kamay. In the 24 senators, may 3 lang. Binay, Po, Ontiveros, De Lima, 4. Okay? Partner kaya sila? And that's the point. Sa Congress, ilan lang din, mabibilang lang. 6. People are free from discrimination based on race, color, ethnicity, class, gender, religion, or any other attribute such as physical, disability, aging, etc. Yung ibang punto dyan, yes, natupad. But gender, may issue din dyan. Sa gender, kasi the LGBTQI+, sabi nila, dinidiscriminate kami sa work at sa ibang larangan. What about religion? May discrimination? Yes. Especially itong mga exclusivist mag-isip. Sa amin, in the Christian world, ang daming mga exclusivist mag-isip, especially the Protestant groups, the born-again groups. Kami lang maligtas. Kayong mga Katoliko, go to hell. Grabing discrimination. Okay? Kasi wala sa Bible yan. Pero that question there, sino naman gumawa sa Bible? Okay? The Catholic Church. Walang Catholic Church, wala ding Bible. Hindi nila maintindihan yon. Then what about this physical disability? May discrimination din. Mga tigulang, I think, mayroon ding discrimination. Kaya nga, sabi, in the United States, ang mga cashier doon, mga senior citizen. Pero dito sa atin, senior citizen, itinatapon na lang. So that's the point there. 7. The needs of future generations are reflected in the current policies. The number 8, economic and social policies are responsible to people needs and aspiration. Economic and social policies. Pero the question is, majority of the Filipino people are still poor, marginalized, abandoned, oppressed. That's the point there. Next, number 9, economic and social policies are aimed at eradicating, eradicate, especially poverty, expanding the choices that all people should have it in their lives. Kaya the problem nowadays is really itong how to eradicate this poverty. Kasi pahambog lang tayo, nag-level up mga tao, but now because of the pandemic, ang daming hindi nakakain. Look at this pantry community. Kadami doong maglinya. Dito nga sa atin, sa cathedral, mayroon din kami dyang community pantry. Maawa ako, mga kapatid nating Bangka sa Moro, nagpila, nakatundong. Pero sa amin, wala namang pinipili yan. Pero sabi ko, where are our leaders? Sabi man, barm, mayaman na, billions ang pinag-usapan. Saan na sila? May community pantry ba para mabuhay itong ating mga pagari? That's the point there. Sayang nga, hindi natuloy kasi nagka-COVID. Maraming nagka-COVID din sa aming simbahan, sa loob. Okay, mga workers. So that's the point there. Pero sana makarecover sila para makatulong din sa mga tao. Okay? In order to eradicate naman, kahit na pansamantala lang, to eradicate this poverty. That's under good governance as democracy plus. So another definitions from the World Bank, good governance entails sound public sector management. I think it was also mentioned in the previous slides. Then a legal framework development, that's justice, it was also mentioned there. Then good governance is defined as focusing the legitimacy, accountability, competency, and respect. So we had already mentioned that one. Then, the indispensable characteristics of good governance. Take note, number 1, protection and promotion of civil, political, social, and cultural rights for all. That's indispensable characteristic of good governance. Second, practice of democracy and respect for human rights, including minority rights. It was also mentioned in the previous slide. Then, inclusive political processes allowing genuine participation by all citizens in all countries. Then, freedom of the media to perform their essential role and the right of the public to access to information. The components of good governance are four-dimensional framework. What are those dimensional framework? Of course, the public sector management. Under that is the public expenditure management with the public investment, the budget planning, the budget processes. Then another is the civil service reform, to manage less but manage better. Then sa public sector management, the reform of public enterprises, privatization, strengthening management. Then next, the second dimensional framework is the accountability, and we had mentioned that one already. Constituted an innovation in the bank's sphere of action, described as being at the heart of governance, described as holding public officials responsible for their actions, then horizontal or internal, and vertical or external accountability. The concept of exit, access to other service providers, and the voice, which is the participation. For the first time, equality. For the first time, quality of the government, its ability to satisfy the needs of the citizens apart from the economic performance was put up for discussion. So another component is the legal framework for development. The important contribution to equitable and just society, thus the prospects for social development and poverty alleviation. Then another is focus on the judicial reform, legislative reforms, and improvement of legal education and training. So kailangan din yan. Then the fourth dimensional framework of good governance is the transparency and information. Economic efficiency, prevention of corruption, bawal ang corrupt. So ngayon, nandyan pa rin corruption. Then the analysis, articulation, and acceptance of governmental policies and policy choices. Then what about this corruption? The cross-cutting themes across transparency, information, accountability, the role of law, enhance the engagement of good governments with anti-corruption. Then improving governance is certainly about fighting corruption, although it is also about more than fighting corruption. There are four indicators. The world governance indicators, there are also 6-dimensional framework. What are those framework? The voice and accountability, political stability and lack of violence, the government effectiveness, regulatory quality, then the rule of law and control of corruption. That's the indicators. So ito na yung isa, the components. It has been mentioned natin kanina. Ano na lang yan? Na-mention na rin natin ito. Characteristic of good governance. Participation, role of law, the responsiveness, yung ibang term nandyan. The consensus orientation, equity and inclusiveness, effectiveness, efficiency, and accountability. So it has mentioned, yan na yan, isa-isa na binanggit, and I think we had also discussed that one. Yan. Yan. Then, what about the strategies for good governance? Strategies. Reorienting priorities of the state through appropriate investment in human needs and provision of social safety nets of the poor and marginalized. Ganda sana yung strategies, pero sana gawin talaga ng maigi yan. Then, strengthening state institutions, introducing appropriate reform of functioning of parliament and increasing its effectiveness. Then, enhancing civil service capacity through appropriate reform measures that matches the performance and accountability, then forging new alliances with the civil society, then involving a new framework for government, business, and cooperation. Tingnan na ito. We need to involve our core values for the fusion of our Filipino nation. So, kailangan yon para yung mga elements, yung good governance binabanggit natin, the characteristics, balikan natin to. We need to involve the core values for the fusion of our Filipino nations. Yan. 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 So, with that, thank you very much for listening this recorded lecture. So, anong gagawin ninyo? Simply write a reaction about the implication of this good governance will as good governance. So, submit a reaction paper about all this lecture, or may mga research kayo about good governance, just submit 1 page, 2 pages reaction paper about good governance. And with that, I hope you learned something. Then, thank you for listening. Dalawa lang man kayo. God bless you. Dalaygon ang Diyos.